Good morning, and welcome to part 23 of our long study in the book of Ecclesiastes. As we go through this still, it's important to understand and remember that Solomon's trying to find the real meaning of life, and he's trying to do it from a perspective of there being essentially no God, although he talks about God a lot. It's also important to remember that Solomon was considered to be the wisest man who ever lived. And it's no surprise, therefore, that he spends a lot of time talking about wisdom. In the first few chapters, he's talked about the end of both a wise man and of a fool being the same, and yet it's important to be wise rather than a fool. And now in chapter 7, he's talked about some of the incongruities of life, some of the perplexities of life not being the way we seem to want to perceive it. How it's more important to be in a house of mourning, to build character, to be in a place of serious concern rather than in a place of mirth all the time. Of how it's important to take the hard way, the long way, as long as it's the correct way, and not necessarily the easy way. How it's better to be rebuked by someone in a constructive manner than to take just the false praise of someone who wants to make you feel good or to get in your good graces. How wisdom helps you deal with this, and then how it gives you a way of looking at things, a way of going, a perspective. If you look at different problems and different ways life deals with us, and we deal with life, how it's good to have a better perspective, and wisdom can do that. And then in the latter part of chapter 7, he talks about the authority and the confidence and the power that wisdom gives you. If you understand that wisdom can provide you with some answers and can give you the authority and the confidence to deal with people, the people you employ, people who you are under, and just with life in general, you have a better confidence and a better ability to deal with situations. So, having wisdom seems to give a lot of benefits to those who have it. But now in chapter 8, he takes a different tact, because he says that the main thing about having true wisdom is to be humble about it. You have wisdom through God and not through yourself. True wisdom comes from above. And this is what it says in Proverbs 9, verse 11, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. For by me your days will be multiplied, and years of life will be added to you. Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So now he gets into chapter 8. And there are 5 points here which David Jeremiah brings out quite well in his book, Searching for Heaven and Earth. And I'm going to follow those points because I think it makes it fairly clear. Verse 8. Who is like a wise man? And who knows the interpretation of a thing? A man's wisdom makes his face shine, and the sternness of his face is changed. This is really the first point about humility, because humility is really knowing how much you actually know. It says, who is like a wise man? Who really knows everything? Who really knows the interpretation of a thing? This is one of the main facets of being truly wise, is that you actually know that you don't know very much. It says in 1 Corinthians 8:2, and if anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. Proverbs is full of statements that tells us not to be wise in our own mind. Isaiah, first of all, in chapter 5, verse 21, says, woe to those who are wise in their own eyes and prudent in their own sight. And then Proverbs 3:7 says, do not be wise in your own eyes. Proverbs 12:15 says, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes. And Proverbs 26 verse 5 says, a fool, answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes. So the first point that Solomon's making about having wisdom is not to think you know everything. Know what you don't know. And this is one of the main features of having true wisdom, is knowing how much you actually do know and knowing what you don't know. And Proverbs is full of this, in saying, wisdom comes from God, not from your own mind. So, number one, humility and knowing what you do not know. And secondly, humility is living with what you often don't like. Go on to the next verse. For the word of a king, I say, keep the king's commandment for the sake of your oath to God. Do not be hasty to go from his presence. Do not take your stand for an evil thing, for he does whatever pleases him. Where the word of a king is, there is power. And who may say to him, what are you doing? He who keeps his command will experience nothing harmful, and a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment, because for every matter there is a time and judgment. Through the misery of man increases greatly. For he does not know what will happen, so who can tell him when it will occur? Humility is often liking and living with what we don't necessarily like. It says here to honor governments, not to be argumentative with them, but to do what they ask you to do, with one exception which I'll bring up later. So it says, if he who keeps his command will experience nothing harmful, and a wise man's heart discerns both time and judgment. There are many things which governments do which we do not necessarily like. However, the Bible says, and it indicates, that we are to follow the instructions of our governments and of our ruling bodies, primarily because the government, being loyal to a government, is like taking an oath, and taking an oath to a government is like taking an oath to God. Romans 9:20 puts it this way, but indeed, O man, who are you to reply against God? Will the thing formal say to him will the thing formed say to him who formed it, why have you made me this way? So we don't necessarily argue with God, and we shouldn't argue with God, but we do sometimes argue mightily with governments. But governments were formed under God according to the Bible. And in olden times, it was not unusual for kings to take an oath before God. Solomon did so, David did so, Josiah did so. So their oath was to God to help their people, to deal with their people. So in a sense, it is taking an oath to God to follow the instructions and the commandments and the requests of government. Now, it doesn't necessarily we like to do it, but we are supposed to do it, as long as those instructions are not against the will of God. So, for instance, during this pandemic, when we're instructed to wear masks, to wash our hands, to social distance, those are instructions which we are to follow because the government requests us to do it. And if we all did that, we'd probably be out of this situation a lot faster than we're going right now. So we are to follow the commandments of God, and that's what this section really says. Now, it also goes over to Romans. If you go to Romans chapter 13, verses 1 to 3, it says, let every soul be subject to the governing authorities, For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. Now, we may not like what the governments all do, and we may not appreciate what they do, but we are to follow their ordinances, providing they do not go against the ordinance of God. And if we go to Acts chapter 4, verse 19, when Peter and John were in front of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish court, who ordered them not to teach about Christ and not to teach about God, this is what they said: whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than God, more than God, you judge. But we cannot but speak the things which we have seen and heard. So if government ordinances are against God's word and against the authority of God, then we should speak about them and refuse to do them. But other than that, we are to do what the government asks us to do, the authorities ask us to do, even though we may not like it. We may not be wanting to do it, but we are to continue to do what is said. And this is what this says: have the wisdom and the humility to do what we don't like, but to still live by it. And then we get into the third, verse 15, where it says, no one has power over the Spirit to retain the Spirit, and no one has power in the day of death. There is no release from that way, and wickedness will not deliver those who are given to it. So the third way in which we are humble is to accept things that we cannot change and have the wisdom to know this. There are certain things we cannot change, and Dr. Jeremiah lists 4 of them. The first one is death. We cannot change death. We can modify it and maybe prolong our life to some degree, but in the ultimate time, we will die. We cannot avoid that. Whether we are wicked, or whether we are good, whether we are wise, or whether we are foolish, it doesn't make any difference. We all will die at some time. So the idea is not to fight against this, to understand the humility that death has this advantage over us in this lifetime, and we can't really do anything ultimately about it. So that's the first thing. Philippians, however, says our attitude towards death can be this: for to Paul, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. See, it depends upon the attitude that you really look towards life and towards death. This is where wisdom comes in. If you have the wisdom to know that there is something after this life, then it makes the death of this in this life more tolerable and not nearly as painful. And why? And people worry about dying. People worry about death all the time. But Matthew 6, verse 7 says, which of you by worrying can add 1 cubit to his stature? Can add 1 bit to his height? Can add 1 day to his life? Nobody can live longer by worrying about it. So therefore, wisdom gives you the humility to accept the fact that we're going to die and not to get too uptight about that fact. Secondly, wisdom also allows us not to be too distressed. And worrying, of course, is one of those aspects of stress which many of us go through, many on a day-to-day basis. But as it says in Matthew, which of you can add 1 cubit to your stature, 1 day to your existence by worrying? So worrying is something which we should try to avoid as much as possible, and have the humility to understand that distress is something which is going to persist with us regardless. So, we cannot change death. We cannot change necessarily our distress. Sometimes there's a deception. We get deceived. We get deceived by looking at what people do, and the fact that the wicked seem to survive as long or longer than the righteous, and vice versa. And it says, all this I have seen, and applied my heart to every work that is done under the sun. There is a time in which one man rules over another to his own hurt. So people who rule, people who are in authority, people who are in places of power, often rule over others so that those people under them are hurt, are subjected to some kind of cruelty, subjected to some kind of pain, subjected to some kind of misery. And this is what this says. I have seen this, that there's a time in which one man rules over another to his own hurt. Then I saw the wicked buried, who had come and gone from the place of holiness, and they were forgotten in the city where they had so done. This also is vanity, because the sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily. Therefore the heart of the sons of men is fully set in them to do evil. Though a sinner does evil 100 times and his days are prolonged, yet I surely know that it will be well with those who fear God, who fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, nor will he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he does not fear before God. There is a vanity which occurs on earth, that there are just men to whom it happens according to the work of the wicked. Again, there are wicked men to whom it happens according to the work of the righteous. I said this also is vanity. The idea is that people are deceived. People are deceived that because those who seem to do evil prosper and sometimes have a long life, those who do good sometimes suffer and have a short life. Those who do good sometimes get hit with all the pitfalls and potholes of life, and those who do wicked sometimes sail right through it. This seems to be an incongruous type of judgment as far as God is concerned, but what Solomon is saying is that it's not something which we should fret about, because in the end there will be a judgment and a punishment for those people as well. Even people who do evil on earth are sometimes lauded and cheered on by others. Their evilness is forgotten. It's not unusual to see someone who has a long criminal record, a person who's never done anything really good in his life, have a very big funeral. But this is all something which is part of the deception. People are deceived into believing that by doing wrong, you're actually doing what is right, and vice versa. But this is not something that we should be deceived by, because in the end, there is punishment. Everything that is done will in the end be punished. And this is what Solomon is saying, that it will be well with those who fear God, who fear before him. Even though the sinner's days are prolonged, it will be well with those who fear God and fear before him. But it will not be well with the wicked, nor will he prolong his days, which are as a shadow, because he does not fear before God. So there is both a deception and sometimes even a defiance. People will shake their hand at God. It is said that Stalin, when he was on his deathbed, when he knew he was dying, looked towards heaven and shook his fist at God in defiance. But this does no one any good in the end. We still all die, and we still will stand before our Maker. So this is where humility comes in, the accepting what we can't change. And then the fourth thing in having the humility of wisdom is enjoying even what we can't explain. We can't explain all that is done, that is seen, that is happening in this world. We cannot explain it, even though we try. And there are some things which we'll never explain this side of the veil. But Solomon says, enjoy life anyway. Enjoy what life you can. Don't get all worried about what you can't explain. He says, so I commended enjoyment because a man has nothing better under the sun than to eat, drink, and be merry. For this will remain with him in his labor all the days of his life, which God gives him under the sun, S-U-N. Don't get all worried and hot under the collar because you don't understand everything. Nobody has all the answers. And wisdom is really knowing the fact that you can't explain things. You can't really explain things the way you would always like to have them. It says in 1 Corinthians 3:12, for now we see in a glass darkly. We see only in part. But then we will see face to face. Then it will be face to face and things will be clearer. So have patience. It's going to come eventually. But in the meantime, enjoy what life we have. Enjoy what we can do. Enjoy what we do know. But have the wisdom to know that we will not know everything. And not only do we not know everything, we will not discover everything. And wisdom is knowing the fact that we won't discover everything. Science is great at discovering and at improving, increasing our knowledge. And it says that knowledge is actually now increasing, almost doubling every 1 to 2 years. But the more we solve, the more answers we seem to find, all it does is bring up additional questions. So that there's always something beyond what we know, and certain things we're never going to discover. Humility is knowing the fact that we won't discover everything. And this is what goes on when he follows on in the next verse. When I applied my heart to know wisdom and to see the business that is done on earth, even though one sees no sleep day or night, one works day or night without sleeping, then I saw all the work of God, that a man cannot find out the work that is done under the sun. For though a man labors to discover it, yet he will not find it. Moreover, though a wise man attempts to know it, he will not be able to find it. What Solomon is saying is there are certain things that God has put in place, certain things which are in this universe that we're never going to discover. Even though we put all our efforts into finding it, there's always going to be something beyond what we know, what we find out, something beyond that eludes us, that we're just not going to discover. And wisdom is having the humility to accept the fact that we're not going to discover it all. So, in this chapter, Solomon is saying, it's great to have wisdom. And true wisdom will give you the power and the authority over certain things. It will give you the ability to look at things in the proper perspective. But yes, true wisdom is having the humility to accept the fact that we are only human and we are not going to know everything. We're not going to be able to discover everything. So we have to understand and know what we don't know. We have to be able to live even with things we don't like. We're going to have to accept those things that we cannot change. We're going to have to enjoy even what we can't explain. We're going to have to understand that there are things beyond our ability to discover. So this is Solomon's tact on wisdom in this chapter, to be humble about it, to know what you can, to learn what you can discover, to learn what you're able to learn, but to understand there are limits to it all, and to be humble enough to admit it. This is true wisdom, and it begins with understanding that God is really in control. The beginning of wisdom is the fear of God, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Proverbs. That's the end of the lesson for today. We'll get on to chapter 9 next week. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you next week. Bye for now.